Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're diving into the last week of Jesus's life.
Yeah.
And specifically we're looking at it through this lens of Jewish customs and the Passover celebration.
Right.
And this is something that I think can really add a whole other level of depth and understanding to what we read in the Gospels, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like you're reading a story and you kind of get the gist of it, but then somebody explains the cultural background to you, and suddenly it's like, oh wow, now I understand all these nuances I didn't see before.
Yeah.
It really brings it to life, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's one thing to kind of have the black and white picture, but then to see it in full color with all the richness and the depth. And so to help us do that today, you shared this fantastic book with us called Jesus Christ Our Passover.
Yes.
And this is not, your typical kind of devotional book, right? I mean, this author really went deep. I mean, even held research seminars to make sure that they were getting the timeline of events exactly right.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about this book, that meticulous attention to detail. Because if we're going to really understand the significance of these events, we need to understand, how they fit into the world as Jesus actually experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's unpack some of this. The book makes this really interesting point that Jesus's Last Supper with his disciples might not have actually been a Passover Seder, like the traditional ritual meal that we might picture when we think about that event.
Right.
What makes the author say that?
Well, there are a few things. For example, there's no mention of a lamb being eaten at this meal. And that's a pretty significant detail when you consider the traditional understanding of Passover, right?
Right, yeah, that's kind of a central part of it.
Exactly. And that traditional timeline, it tries to align Jesus' crucifixion with the Passover sacrifice, but when you look at the details, it doesn't quite add up.
Okay. So does that mean that like we've had it wrong all this time or what?
I would say wrong necessarily. But I think it's more accurate to say that, our understanding has evolved over time. And,
Yeah.
and this book is really helpful because it highlights those different interpretations. Early Christians had different ways of calculating the Passover. So it's not as simple as saying this is the right way or the wrong way. It's about understanding those nuances.
Right. And it's interesting because when you think about it, so much of how we interpret scripture is based on tradition and things that we've been taught. But to actually go back to the original context, the original culture, it can really shift your perspective.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about this author. They're not afraid to challenge those traditional interpretations, but they always do it in a way that's very respectful and grounded in really solid research.
Yeah, that comes across. Okay, so we've got this whole question about the Last Supper, which is already kind of blowing my mind. But then there's this other point that you highlighted in the book that I have to admit I'd never even considered before. And that's the idea that Jesus might have actually been buried not once, but twice.
Right.
Talk about a plot twist. What is that about?
I know. It's one of those details that you can easily miss if you're just reading through the Gospels quickly. But the book really digs into the actions of two figures, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus.
Yes.
Now, both of them were involved in preparing Jesus's body for burial. But the author points out that they didn't do it together.
Oh.
And that's pretty significant when you consider their backgrounds. Joseph was a wealthy member of the Jewish council, and Nicodemus was a Pharisee. They moved in very different circles.
Yeah.
So the book raises this question. What if they had different motivations? What if they had different understandings of who Jesus was and what his death meant?
Wow.
And that's what could explain why they might have been involved in separate burials.
Wow. Okay, so we've got a potential double burial, Last Supper, that might not be what we thought. I'm sensing a theme here. This book definitely kind of challenges our assumptions, doesn't it?
It does. And I think that's a good thing. Sometimes we need to have our assumptions challenged in order to see things with fresh eyes. And that's what this book does so well.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? What other kind of surprising details did you find as you were reading through this?
Well, we were talking about how this book dives into some of those like really thorny parts of the Easter story, the things people have debated for centuries. And I feel like this author just dives right in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one thing to kind of skirt around the edges of those things, but to really kind of like get in there and grapple with them, I feel like that takes a certain amount of courage as a writer,
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think for the reader too, right? Like
Yep.
it invites us to really wrestle with these questions in a way that maybe we haven't before.
Yeah, absolutely. So what were some of the ones that stood out to you as you were reading?
Well, one that I found really, really interesting was the author's analysis of Judas Iscariot's death.
Oh, yeah. Judas, I mean, talk about a controversial figure.
Yeah.
His betrayal of Jesus is obviously like this pivotal moment in the story. And then, of course, there's, the whole question of his death, which is often shrouded in mystery and debate.
Exactly. And there are so many different interpretations out there. But what I appreciate about this author's approach is that they don't try to say this is the right answer, you
Mm.
know. It's more about let's look at the cultural context, let's look at the historical context, let's look at the different possible interpretations, and I found that really refreshing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I feel like often when we encounter these kinds of questions, there's this pressure to like have the right answer or to like align ourselves with a particular interpretation. But this book really kind of frees us from that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it invites us to ask those questions without fear,
Yeah.
because I think sometimes we're almost afraid to ask the hard questions because we're afraid of what the answers might mean. But this author really encourages us to embrace that questioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of hard questions, the book also delves into the accusations that were leveled against Jesus during his trial.
Yes.
And again, I feel like this is an area where understanding the historical and cultural context is so crucial.
Absolutely. Because those accusations weren't made in a vacuum, right? They were rooted in very specific cultural and religious understandings of the time. And if we don't understand those, then we're not going to fully grasp the weight of those accusations or how they would have been perceived by the people who were hearing them.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's like we can read those words on the page, but unless we understand the world in which those words were spoken, we're only getting like a fraction of the meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like if you were to read a transcript of a conversation, but you didn't know anything about the people who were speaking or the situation that they were in, you might be able to understand the words themselves, but you would miss all of the nuances, all of the subtext, all of the unspoken things that are being communicated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like reading a play but not seeing the actors or the setting. You're missing so much of the story.
Exactly. And so by taking the time to really understand the historical and cultural context of Jesus's trial, this author helps us to see those accusations in a whole new light.
Yeah. And I think this all kind of comes back to something that we talk about a lot on this show, which is that like knowledge is power. And that's especially true when it comes to understanding like history and religion and culture, because the more we understand the context of these things, the more equipped we are to engage with them in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Jesus Christ Our Passover. It's not just presenting information, it's empowering the reader to engage with that information in a way that can deepen their faith.
Hmm. Now, I want to shift gears just a bit here and talk about the book's overall impact. It's one thing to like uncover all these fascinating historical details, but what does it all mean in the grand scheme of things? How does this kind of meticulous approach, this deep dive into history and culture, change how we read the Gospels? It makes you realize that there's always more to uncover, even in stories we think we know, like backwards and forwards.
Yeah. It's like we can read these stories 100 times, but there's always something new to discover,
Yeah.
you know? And that's what makes Jesus Christ Our Passover so interesting. It reminds us that, history, especially biblical history, is not just like set in stone. It's a living thing.
Right. Like it's not just dates and facts, it's a conversation.
Right.
An ongoing process of interpretation and understanding.
Exactly. And this book, I think, does a really good job of inviting us to be a part of that conversation. It
Yeah.
encourages us to ask the hard questions
Mhm.
and not be afraid of, coming to different conclusions than maybe what we were taught growing up or what we've always believed.
Right. Which, let's be honest, that can be kind of scary sometimes. It's easy to just stick with what's familiar, even if it doesn't like completely make sense to us.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's something so rewarding, I think, about being willing to wrestle with those questions,
Yeah.
about really digging deep and being open to having our perspectives challenged and changed.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that's how we grow, right? Both
Yeah.
intellectually and spiritually. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here into Jesus Christ, our Passover, what's the one thing that you hope our listeners kind of take away from this conversation?
If I had to pick just one, I think it would be this. Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions.
Mm.
Don't be afraid to dig deeper, to challenge your assumptions, to be open to new perspectives.
Yeah.
Because it's in those moments of questioning and seeking that we often find the most profound truths.
Beautifully said. And you know, that's what we're all about here on the deep dive, right? It's about equipping you, the listener, with the knowledge and the insights to go out there and explore the world around you with curiosity and open minds.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, keep asking those questions, keep seeking those aha moments, and most importantly, keep diving deep into the topics that fascinate you, because you never know what you might discover.
And if this exploration of Jesus Christ Our Passover has piqued your interest, we definitely encourage you to check out the book for yourself. It's a fascinating read that will really stay with you long after you've turned that last page. Until next time, happy diving, everyone.